I am very excited to welcome our two guests today. I want to give you a little bit of background info on our presenters. Dr. Minette Church has been with the UCCS faculty since 1997. In the fall and spring of 2016-2017, she was also a visiting research fellow in the Department of Anthropology and Palaeoecology in the School of Natural and Built Environment at Queen's University in Belfast. She earned her master's in Museum Curatorship in 1991 and her Ph.D. in American Civilization Historical Archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania in 2001. Her areas of geographic interest are Belize, Central America, and the U.S. Mexico borderlands. In both regions, she focuses on the archaeology of parenting and childhood, landscape archaeology, border regions, and colonial, post-colonial, transnational identities. Our other presenter is Dr. Karen Larkin. Welcome. Dr. Karen Larkin is an assistant professor and curator. She received her PhD in anthropology and master's in museum studies from CU Boulder. She has done archaeological fieldwork in numerous regions, including the Southwest, Chihuahua, the Ludlow Massacre site, and on the UCCS campus. Her research focuses on understanding community interaction, social change, and negotiating social discord through material culture. She is the co-editor of the Archaeology of Class War 2009 by the University of Colorado Press and has published 2 book chapters on ceramics from the Casas Grandes region of Chihuahua, Mexico. Very excited to have both of our presenters today. I'm going to ask them to turn on their mics and their video. I do want to say that if anybody today has a question for our presenters, please use the chat function. So what you'll do is just go into that chat function, enter your question. I'll keep track of those questions throughout the program. And then at the very end, when Karen and Minette are ready, just let me know and I can ask those questions and get their answers then. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. My name's Karen Larkin, today Minette and I are planning on talking about Colorado Springs archaeological past, and we're really going to be focusing on the more recent past. But before we get started, we do want to see if my slides will work. There we go. We do want to first sort of offer a few words about the people who were on this land before us. And we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, which is a formal statement that recognizes and honors the indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of this land. So we have it written here. And this basically, in this land acknowledgement, we're acknowledging the tribes who have cultural affiliation with this area. And those include the 3 Ute tribes: Cheyenne, Arapaho, Hickory, Apache, Pawnee, Kiowa, Osage, and Lakota. And we just want to acknowledge that saying a land acknowledgement by itself is sort of a hollow or empty gesture without actually taking some form of action to really recognize them as the original stewards of the land. And so as part of that, we've been doing a bit of consultation with these affiliated tribal representatives, and they've asked us to pass along a little message for you as people who are going to be encountering their sort of cultural past. And so we do quite a bit of non-historic archaeology. We call it prehistoric because that's convenient, but it's not really a great term. And so part of what you might see are these really sort of ephemeral evidence for them on the landscape, and that might include lithic flakes or other sort of stone features. And what we really ask is that you don't help us out by doing things like collecting them all in piles here. And the reason we ask you not to do that is that when you move them from their original location, we lose some of that context, and so we can't see how things are, how big the site is, or make some interpretations. So we lose a lot of information that way. The other thing that we see quite a bit is sort of these really ephemeral features like stone circles here. And one of the things that we noticed when we were doing consultation is from the first time that we saw this feature that you see here on your right, to the second time we visited this feature, somebody had come in and made a little cairn in the middle of it and rearranged the feature. And our tribal representatives were a little upset about that. So we asked that if you do come across evidence of people from the past, if you could not move them around or take them home with you. I know it's really tempting because they're very cool, but it really does make it much more difficult for us as archaeologists, and it also sort of upsets the original stewards of this land. I'll pass it over to Minette for a moment.
All right, sorry, can you see me yet? There I am, okay. So I just, in the same vein of respecting people and who've been on this landscape and who are the original stewards of this landscape, the joint tribal, the Southern Ute and the Mountain Ute tribal representatives, various elders and governmental organization groups, they have put out a joint statement about alleged Ute prayer trees. And so some of you will have heard presentations about quote unquote bent, well, they are bent trees. And so the Ute have well, I'll just read you a little bit of their statement. This statement is the official position of the Southern Ute Indian tribe and the Ute Mountain Indian tribe of the Ute Nation regarding bent trees within the heartland of our Aboriginal territory and ancestral hunting grounds in the state of Colorado. While other tribes may have conducted these types of practices, the practice of bending trees is not part of the customary cultural traditions of Ute people, past or present, who comprise the Southern Ute and Ute Mountain Ute Indian tribes. So this is a pretty powerful statement by the two the two indigenous groups who have still a landed presence in Colorado. Many other groups that have been stewards of land in Colorado in the past were moved out. In fact, some of the Ute were moved out by President Lincoln. But we wanted to put this in there because there's been a lot of confusion, let me say, out in the public domain about these bent quote unquote prayer trees. And the Ute wanted to communicate with this statement that those are not theirs. In fact, if you talk to foresters who work for the city or for the Forest Service, they will tell you that there is actually a lot of natural explanations for those kinds of bent trees, and that they may not actually even be cultural at all. So, so I don't know, back to you, Karen.
Okay. So most of what we're going to talk about today is work that we did as part of archaeological field schools through UCCS. And this picture here is just showing you some of the past field schools, including the 2020, this past year's field school. And I'm sure that you can tell which group is from the 2020 field school based on their really fancy new face coverings that we did wear the entire time in the field. So most of what we're going to be discussing today is post-1870, and it's stuff that we would consider urban archaeology. So Minette found this really fun little cartoon here that illustrates this idea of historic archaeology or urban archaeology. While what we do does include research of Native American sites today, we're actually going to be focusing on sites that are going to help us round out the more recent history of Colorado Springs for about 1870 on. And we're going to talk about what we can learn from archaeology of this more recent past, and archaeology in a time when we actually have written records. What can archaeology sort of help us understand better and learn about? So that's what we're going to focus on today. And I'm going to pass the mic back to Minette.
Okay, let me catch up on my own screen here for a second. All right, we are here. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was the way in which in the last, well, for me, decades, and for Karen, over a decade, we've been at UCCS. We've really started not just with our work, not just with faculty from UCCS, but in combination of work that we've done, work that our students has done, work that cultural resource management companies have been hired to do for the city of Colorado Springs. We're starting to have reach a tipping point of all the information that we can start to put together to really get a much more well-rounded sense than we would have had when I first got here in 1997 of how average everyday people living in Colorado Springs were living before and after the turn of the 20th century. And so here is a slide which is references work in a neighborhood that we didn't do. Actually, Bill Arbacast, who some of you may know, who is also an affiliate at in our department, when I had been here 2 years, that he was contacted by the Colorado Springs Utilities and asked us to come out and look at a site that was the original main dump site for the city of Colorado Springs, for much of the working class neighborhoods of Colorado Springs. They were going to be building a railroad spur, and they really were hoping that Bill and I could bring students out on the weekends. But if you know anything about a dump site that's been used for a very long time, it was enormous. And it was much more than we could do with students on weekends. So they ended up hiring an archaeological cultural resource management company to come and do right by the resource and do archaeology. And so they did a lot of work in around 2001 on this site. And so what I'm showing you now, this is from 2018, and it's the Mill Street neighborhood plan, and some excerpts from that plan from the City of Colorado Springs webpage. And the Mill Street neighborhood will be a thriving, dynamic place that celebrates its diversity and history. And so I want to talk for just a minute about sustainability. And when we think about sustainability, we often think in terms of carbon footprint and kind of more environmental values. But one big part of, I'm biased, I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist and a historian, but one big part of sustainability is also just history and a sense of community. And so this is the neighborhood plan, and part of their vision statement about how the community sees itself in the future explicitly refers to the history of the neighborhood and so this archaeology of the dump site and this view we got of working class neighborhoods in Colorado, and what people lived with, the material culture of everyday life in that period, is something that we got from doing that kind of research. And now they're looking at architecture and other kinds of historical resources in this neighborhood plan. So if we could go to the next slide. Can I do that, or do you have to? There we go. Thank you. So this is just another slide with sort of their action plan from this 2018, and I'm sure that some of this has been derailed, like everything else, by COVID. But part of their plan again is gather historical information about the area to establish its significance, examine the individual properties within the area to determine how much and in what ways they've changed over time, and so, you know, it's sort of funny to think of a dump site as a significant archaeological site, but it has actually been declared by our state office as eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So if we could go to the next slide. And if you think about it, those of you who were in town and were watching the news a few years ago, there was a lot of news, both TV news and newspaper news about the Palmer dump site. And so dump sites are actually, you know, what do archaeologists do? We scavenge in other people's garbage. That's what we do. And so here we have this working class dump site in the Mill Street neighborhood, which is, there's a report out on that. And then here we had this Palmer dump site, which initially, after the 2013 floods, many of you who've seen Anna Cordova's talk about this, well, this will be a little redundant. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. But after the 2013 floods, FEMA got involved, and there was work on the property that belonged to the city, and also, you know, Glen Erie, that area, to try to mitigate the flood damage and mitigate future flood damage, more importantly, by building, I always want to call them retention ponds, but they're called detention ponds. And somebody else can tell you what the difference is. But at any rate, they found Palmer's dump. They found a dump site, and they didn't think initially it was significant. And then Anna Cordova went in there and found artifacts that linked it directly to one of our founding families of Colorado Springs, William Jackson Palmer and his wife, Queen Palmer. And not only was it the dump site of all their things, so sort of a slice of how the kind of upper class lived in Colorado Springs, but also everybody who worked for them on their property. So a lot of things there as well. So I see a link to the map showing the springs. So that's two dump sites that really give you a good cross-section of the turn of the century life in Colorado Springs, late 19th and even into the early years of the 20th century, in kind of a big picture way, particularly in terms of class identity. The Chambers House is another project that I did with some students back in around 2001, 2002. And here's Elsie Chambers and her husband. And let me catch up on my slides here. So the things to remember, and I'm sorry if I'm looking off to the side, it's because my notes here are off to the side. I'm not, staring off into space. But this is Robert Chambers and Elsie with their children, Ben, Eleanor, and Bessie. They moved from Pennsylvania to Denver. I think a lot of people moved to Colorado Springs from Pennsylvania. There seems to be a real connection between early Colorado Springs and Pennsylvania. And I'm sorry, I'm becoming ever more ghostly here as the sun starts to come down. So they came out in 1874. They built what we now know as Rockledge Ranch, the original stone house there. So there was a homestead there before. They bought that from the original homesteader. And Mr. Chambers was the school board president. They began to create community in Colorado Springs. He was the school board president. She started a school in that house, in that stone house. She was active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So those of you who know about the founding of our city and Palmer wanting to make it a dry town, she was right on board with that. They built an extensive irrigation system and reservoir. And again, around the same time, their neighbor to the north, General Palmer, was doing the same kind of thing. And they ended up selling produce to the Antlers Hotel in Colorado Springs. They also earned money by boarding tuberculosis patients on the second floor of their house. And in 1900, they decided to retire to California and sold their property to General William Palmer for $17,000. And Rockledge Ranch became part of the Glen Erie estate. So here is the, you're reading my mind, thank you, Karen. So here is the Chambers House, two different pictures, one from 1885 and one from 1905. And what happened was that the city contacted me because they wanted to create a wheelchair ramp. So they were modifying the area outside of the historic Chambers House to make it more wheelchair accessible and whatnot. And so they wanted to do due diligence and do archaeological testing to make sure that they were, this was the side yard right off of the kitchen. And so there was potential for some interesting archaeological resources, and they didn't want to just go in there and build retaining walls and ramps without doing some archaeology. So, so they were doing the right thing. And so here are two pictures, and one of the things that the arrows point more or less to the side yard where we were working. And I just want to point out on the slide on the left that there are a lot of outbuildings outside of the main Chambers House there, and it's pretty flat. There's no retaining wall. Well, by the time we got to it, it had been built up, and there was a lot of fill in that yard. But we didn't realize that at first. So we started to excavate into the fill. In other words, it had been previously disturbed, but we still found a fair amount of archaeological materials. And so I don't have pictures of the materials themselves, but here it shows there's a map of the yard on the left. What that just shows is it's almost like a topographic map, but instead of hills in that side yard, in that square, it's artifact densities. So we did shovel probes to find where in the yard we would have the most artifacts. The brown dotted line was where they wanted to build this retention wall or shore it up in this fill. And then the one on the right there, you see these little sort of pie charts for each of those shovel probes. And I'll tell you that the vast majority of what we found was architectural debris from tearing down all those little, probably all those little outbuildings. But we also found a lot of kitchen debris, like a lot of faunal bone, a lot of butchered bone. I think we found some cattle and some fowl, chickens and turkeys and things like that. A little bit of firearms, perhaps even things that had been used to shoot the animals that they were eating. Livestock related things, because of course they also had livestock. And then some personal and sort of kitchen domestic debris. So when it says subsistence, we're talking fragments of plates and things that they would have used to eat off of. And what I didn't put a picture of in here that I meant to is in the wall, we found a lot of charcoal and coal as well. And in the wall of the Chambers House, when they were doing renovations and restoration for historical interpretation, they found a coal stove that they had not known was there. And in the wall, they found a receipt or a coal receipt from around the turn of the century for buying coal. So we think of excavation as being in the ground, but sometimes when you're doing renovation in your house, you find newspapers and things. In some ways, you're excavating in the walls of the house as well. And one of the other interesting things we found to round this out was we hit on the upper right there, feature one, which is the top of this circular, what we decided, we thought, is this a well? But it didn't have the kind of fill or integrity that a well would have. And so down on the left, the photograph you see are these structures that are associated with Palmer's irrigation lines that came through this area. And the middle is a technical drawing of the well after we excavated a little bit, or of this irrigation feature after we had excavated a little bit. And so what we think is that we have the top of the irrigation structure, and that's what tipped us off. And the wall was weak. There's a retaining wall that you can kind of see part of along one edge of it up on the upper right. That retaining wall had a weak zone along where this feature was. And this is where we started to realize that there had been a lot of historic fill. And I'll tell you that one of the things you do when you do these recent kinds of sites is people move a lot of dirt around in a lot of places. So they basically had filled up this feature, which had been hollow, with a whole bunch of stuff that looked a little different than the stuff around it. And then they brought in all this fill, and then they put in this retaining wall. And so what that meant was that we couldn't really figure out which stuff exactly went with the chambers and which stuff was maybe post-chambers, except a little bit by date. So dating the artifacts, figuring out manufacture dates. To look at, you know, both not just the material culture of the chambers, but also of the tubercular patients and boarders that they brought in that lived there. And I think that's probably a good segue to back to Karen. No, it's not. Sorry, I jumped the gun. The county poor farm is something that we started looking at just a couple of years ago, and we have not done any excavation, but I did take students out for a field school to do some mapping. And so many people don't realize the existence of the county poor farm, the El Paso County poor farm, but the original building was here between Boulder and St. Vrain on El Paso Street. Let me get into the right place here. There we go. So it was set up in the early 1880s east of downtown on El Paso Street between Boulder and St. Vrain. It operated there until the city surrounded it, and people decided they didn't really like, you know, they built their houses next to a poor farm, and then they decided they didn't really like living next to a poor farm. This is an old story. I think we can all agree. So in 1899, they moved it out to, again, what was then the edge of town, which was this Liebig Ranch property near Bear Creek. And so they moved it out near Bear Creek, and then it too was eventually encircled. And in 1984, the last operational facility of its kind in America, it was forced to close. And so go to the next slide, please. There we go. So this is what the county poor farm that was built around 1900 on the Liebig Ranch. And so you'll see that it's near, it's kind of along what is now 21st Street. It's near the dog park where people take their dogs. And this is the building with the arrows pointing to where it sits. And if you know where the county parks building is, that down there, it's right in that area. But there are still some surface features. The county's done a lot of work, you know, building around there since then, but there's still some features that are visible, and there's irrigation, again, as a theme, irrigation ditches running from down kind of parallel to Bear Creek as well. So, in 1984 it closed, and in 1987 the county demolished it. And unfortunately, I'm going to tell this story because nobody who worked at the county in 1987 is still with the county now. So I can tell this story. When they contracted with contractors to pull down the poor farm, in spite of the fact that there were in 1987 actually laws, state laws about doing archaeology on public lands. In other words, it wasn't strictly legal to just pull it down without having any recording of this historic site, since it was a historic site even then. But at any rate, they pulled it down, and a stipulation of the contract was that the people who were doing the work keep what they found in terms of poor farm residents' belongings. And so there was this story in the Gazette, which you're seeing here, the workers find antique books at the Poor Farm. And we would love, if anybody knows any of these gentlemen or knows anything about or has pictures of the artifacts that they pulled out, this is all we have. And this is all we know about what they found. And so from our perspective, it's data. We're not going to take it away from anybody who's, has this in their families or whatever. But if there's anybody who knows anything about where we might just get information about what they found when they were digging through this, the remains and pulling it down, that would be awesome. We would love to talk to those people. Yes, okay, so I took the students out there and we did some surface recording, and like everywhere else in Colorado Springs, tuberculosis is part of the story at the Poor Farm as well. And so these are students at what was called the pest house or the pestilence house. And if you walk your dogs at the dog park, buried in the bushes, you'll actually see a sign, one of these yellow lettering on brown signs that says pest house. And probably most people have no idea what that is. But it was actually quite a large building, and it was the infirmary for the Poor Farm. And it was where people went who often got sick, but in particular, there was a tuberculosis outbreak. On the right, the student is looking at a terracotta pipe that we noticed goes straight from the infirmary to the creek, which seems kind of unsanitary. But what we also realized is that they pulled the water out of the creek above that to irrigate the fields, luckily, because otherwise there would be more people would be getting tuberculosis. And then up on the corner of 21st Street and the side street, there's the Pauper Cemetery, which many of us drive right past. There were actually graves underneath 21st Street. And when they built that, they moved those graves over to this Pauper Cemetery that's now on the corner. So next slide. Okay, and so this is a slide that John Moore, who was a student of ours and was he's the one who got this whole project, got me interested, got us underway. And so this is something I want to pursue into the future. And he put together this really wonderful poster. And all I want to put out from here is just, again, we have recent archaeology, we have documents. Why is this stuff important? And I would argue, as John does here, that poverty and homelessness plagued Colorado Springs right from its founding. And it continues to be an issue today. And so this Poor Farm provides examples of strategies that have been used in the past to try to manage poverty. And also that people experiencing poverty and homelessness were and are an invisible population who deserve representation. And in light of that, doing this kind of historical research to sort of make invisible people visible and make these pasts available, and that they're important. And he did do a lot of research in the archives, and he found this burial record of Royster Oliver, a Depression-era inhabitant of the Poor Farm. Oliver killed himself by ingesting strychnine while living at the Poor Farm. So people, got tuberculosis, other things happened. But then as now, there were a lot of mental health reasons for people to be at the Poor Farm. And but getting your hands in the soil and that agricultural ideal that dates back to Jefferson, this was this strategy for trying to bring people out of poverty by having them grow their own food and be invested. But when you have a situation of mental health issues, that doesn't, that's not always going to work, right? And in the mid 80s, when they shut down the Poor Farm, there were a lot of other mental institutions being shut down across the country as well. So I think this is a worthwhile project that we'd like to go forward on, but we haven't done any excavation as of yet. So now I think we're transitioning over to Karen. Thank you.
another project that we've been working on is right here on our campus, and that is the Cragmor Sanatorium. You guys might recognize it right now as Main Hall, but Main Hall was at one time a sort of very, infamous and famous sanatorium here in Colorado Springs among the dozens that we had. And Cragmor Sanatorium really catered to the sort of rich and famous tubercular patients. And so Cragmor Sanatorium is actually, slides up, there we go, was actually sort of at its height, and it was originally built in 1904, but was remodeled in 1914 to the building that you recognize mostly today. And at that point, it was really recognized as sort of a premier institution for treating patients with tuberculosis. And at that time, they didn't really have solid treatment plans for people with tuberculosis. They tried a variety of things that seem to have worked. And these are methods that they sort of tried. They would go to medical conferences and talk about the various treatment plans that they had across the world, really. And Cragmor was one of the sort of cutting edge. And so some of the treatments that they practiced were sunbathing, because they believed that sun would sort of help get rid of the tubercular bacteria. And in fact, they even developed, and if you go to the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum exhibit, you can see an example of this, but they even developed things like what they call a laryngoscope, which basically is a giant mirror, and they would stick it sort of down, open your mouth and stick it down into your throat, and shoot sunlight down into your throat to try to kill the tuberculosis. Bacteria, I'm pretty sure that really all it did was maybe give them skin cancer inside their throat. But they were trying a variety of different things at the time. And some of those things included like rest, relaxation, you know, sort of the things that make everybody feel better when you're sick. And the patients at this time really sort of had free rein to do whatever it is that they felt would help them feel better, including lounging around with a cigarette, which I'm also pretty sure isn't the best method for treating tuberculosis. We did do some archaeological testing in areas around campus, and we found a variety of artifacts that sort of hint at what life was like living in Cragmor Sanatorium during this time. For instance, in the lower left-hand corner, you can see a bit of a sort of shallow bowl that has an insignia on it that's C and S, and that's for Cragmor Sanatorium. They have their own plateware, and that's what the patients would be served on every day. You can also see next to that in the sort of bottom middle is a bit of a perfume bottle that we found here in a trash pit on campus, as well as part of a Christmas decoration and a child's toy. So we have evidence that there were mostly adult patients, but the caretakers had their children here on site. And then the later decades, they did treat children with tuberculosis, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Now, Cragmor Sanatorium during this time I mentioned was sort of infamous, and part of its sort of controversial nature is that there are all kinds of stories about movie stars who came here to be treated, or mafioso. And there's one story in particular that there was a sort of mafioso who came to get treated here at Cragmor Sanatorium and set up a sort of illegal speakeasy and gambling operation in one of the cottages associated with Cragmor Sanatorium. And we weren't really sure if that was true. You know, I mean, you hear a lot of rumors, and so we were wondering, I don't know. Well, lo and behold, we were doing some survey, and we found, if you see on the left-hand side there, a little poker chip right near the cottage in which the mafioso was rumored to have run the illegal gambling operation. So we think maybe that was true. Next to that, you can see a bit of a pocket watch. And then we also find interesting rock features that aren't natural, like this rock here on your right. You can see that, I don't know, honestly, what that is. We're still trying to figure out what that is. So when I say, what are these, I'm telling you some things. And if you guys have any suggestions on what this rock feature is, please feel free to send me an email, or if you know for certain. But what we do know with that is that we think it was associated with a feature called the Happy Trail, or the High Trail to Passion, which was one of Dr. Houck's sort of inventions in the late teens and early 1920s. And he really believed that good food and exercise and fresh air would cure you. And so along those lines, he designed and engineered and laid out a 3-mile walking track around that was on level and encircled the bluffs. That's what we found in the historic record. And so this they called it Dr. Houck's Trail, but the patients actually called it the Happy Trail, or the High Trail to Passion, because the patients would use this trail to go out and do some of their illicit drinking, as well as have amorous trysts, which is the High Trail to Passion part of it. But on campus, we were sort of walking up and down the bluff, doing the excavations that you saw earlier, and we found this rock here that you see on the left, that when we first looked at it, we walked past it probably 15 times. And I looked at another archaeologist and I said, does that look like a sort of backward E to you? And she says, well, actually it looks like a 3 to me. And I thought, oh goodness, you know what I bet this is the 3-mile end marker of the Happy Trail. Because we know that Dr. Houck marked each of the miles, and then also had little way markers as well along that path. That rock I told you I don't know what it is along that path. I think it might have been some sort of trail marker, but I don't know what, because it's been so badly eroded. We had a student who did a project trying to identify the potential path of where the Happy Trail might have been. Trying to envision, like, what is actually 3 miles? And 3 miles is a bit longer than you think. And so she did what do you call it? Minette, help me. She did a least cost path analysis using ArcGIS to identify where the Happy Trail potentially could have been, by marking the points where we know that it already was, and then sort of projecting what would have been on level and the distance of 3 miles. And this is what she came up with. And it does actually encircle the bluffs, and it goes up through the Happy Valley, no, what's the name of the, the YMCA up there at Union and Academy. It goes up through that neighborhood in there. And in fact, we later found out that most of that property at the time was owned by Dr. Houck. And so it makes sense that he would survey and route his trail through there. Up in that neighborhood, we were looking for potential markers that could be a 1 or a 2, similar to the 3. We didn't find anything like that, but we did find this rock that you see on the right-hand side that would have been along that projected path that is unnaturally carved. And so we're not sure whether or not that is part of the Happy Trail, but we think it might be. So the Cragmor Sanatorium went through a decline during the Depression era and the 30s and 40s. They provided other types of health services and then really had a revitalization in the early 1950s when the sanatorium board signed a contract with the Navajo Nation to treat Navajo patients with tuberculosis. We call this the Navajo Era, and that really lasted from about 1952. They signed the contract in 1951 through 1964 when they closed their doors. So Navajo Nation was experiencing a huge uptick in tuberculosis, while the rest of the nation was benefiting from the use of antibiotics to treat it as well. So during this time, a councilwoman who served as the sort of health services liaison, her name was Annie Winnetka. And as far as I'm concerned, she was a superhero because what she did was really facilitated treatment for tubercular patients on the Navajo Nation. And the way she did this was through being able to understand sort of the culture of Navajo, as well as the Western healing practices, and being able to translate those to the patients around Navajo Nation. And so what she did was she would go out to ranches, farms, houses that were experiencing tuberculosis, and she would figure out what was keeping them from seeking treatment. And then she would help to identify a way to fix that. And so she also came and visited all of the sanatoriums that treated Navajo patients during this time period. So she did visit Cragmor Sanatorium. We have some records that show her visit here. She tried to visit once a month. So during this time, we also know that Navajo patients were hedging their bets. So, they were willing to give sort of Western medicine a try, but they were also practicing traditional medicine just in case Western medicine failed. As we all know, sometimes it does. And so the Navajo patients here had their own newsletter that they published. And they put together, there's very interesting stories about what life was like. During the Navajo era at Cragmor Sanatorium, they focused on treating women and children, Navajo patients, and patients that were sort of well enough to participate were able to participate in an occupational therapy program so that they were sort of both treating the sort of physical symptoms as well as providing some sort of mental stimulation. They did education around learning the English language, even though they also encouraged patients to continue speaking traditional Navajo. They also did sort of arts and crafts movement. And so there are the rug that you see up in the right-hand corner is one that's actually at the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center that was woven by Navajo patients during this time period at Cragmor Sanatorium. They also practiced beading. They taught them beading and created all these key fobs, which are what you see in the bottom, and you can see those on exhibit at the Pioneers Museum if you go into the Cultural Crossroads exhibit. So these are some of the sort of alternative medicine that they practiced during this time period as well. Now, switching gears, our most recent project, and this is one actually Minette and I have been working on together, is at a site that was owned by a gentleman who we call Fatty Rice. His real name was Edwin Rice, but he called himself Fatty because, as you can see in the next slide, this is a picture of his beer and curio shop that he ran right near Garden of the Gods. And here is a picture of Fatty and his family. And I'm not being sort of rude, I'm not sort of body shaming when I say this. He called himself Fatty, and he actually advertised his size as one of the sort of tourist draws to the shop. And we know that Fatty ran his shop from about 1897 to about 1907, and excuse me, and he sold beer out there at he had visions of a whole beer garden that would sort of be a bunch of these little beer houses around, but General Palmer wasn't a huge fan of that. He didn't really want that sort of in his backyard. But nonetheless, we know that Fatty sold beer, and if you can see at the sort of on the side of the roof there, you can read Zang's Brewing, and Zang's was a brewer out of Denver that he sold here at the shop. So what we were trying to identify out at Fatty Rice's place is we just want to see if we could identify where the site boundaries were. In case, you know, the city wanted to do some trail maintenance or anything along there. We wanted to make sure that they weren't disturbing any sort of important features there at the site. And so we did some testing, some shovel tests, as Minette mentioned, at a different site. We also we brought in a graduate student from the University of Denver named Aaron Costa, and he did some ground penetrating radar, which is the funny orange sled thing that you see on the right hand side. And ground penetrating radar sort of gives us a means of looking below the surface without excavating everything below the surface. And so it gives us sort of a picture of what might have been where at the site. So we're trying to sort of get a feel for what Fatty's shop looked like. So we did find some historic photographs of Fatty's. We saw a couple of them at the beginning, and we used those to sort of identify where on the landscape some of the structures might have been. And most of the photographs that we had before this past year were looking at Fatty's from the front, the way people would have entered the shop. And we were very lucky in this last year to find a photograph of Fatty's from the backside. And we realized that there were a lot of outhouses and outbuildings that we didn't realize were there previously. And so it gave us sort of some new directions in which to look. We also found sort of a large depression that we didn't quite know how to interpret, but looking at this photograph, we can clearly see that it is a pond, which you can see on the left-hand side of the house there in the building. So here's the grids that Aaron did with his ground penetrating radar, and we identified a variety of features, and a couple of the features that we identified that were really interesting was one of them was a stable in which we found some pretty well intact bit of a brick floor. And we think it was a stable, and I'll show you in a minute, because of the artifacts that we found there. But we were just excavating a little 1 meter by 1 meter square, and Aaron's ground penetrating radar indicated that that brick surface extends much bigger than we thought it was, and we think that there's quite a bit more of it there sort of buried underneath the surface that we didn't even touch. So by doing some of the excavation, we learned actually a bit more about Fatty and his family and what their everyday life was like. So, you know, we got indications that they had things like electricity out there, some a stick pin showing, some personal adornment, decorations. The sort of middle on the left, we believe is a horse bit for part of a bridle. On the bottom, you can see we found several sort of bullet casings, a couple of 22s and some 44s, indicating that they were probably trying to protect their livestock, their selves, as well as possibly doing some hunting out and around the site. Some of the interesting stuff that we found also included this oyster shell that you see up in the top right, or sorry, left. And if you were paying attention to the Palmer's dump site, when all of that news was coming out, one of the really interesting things they found there were fresh oysters that were being shipped in from the East Coast for the Palmers to feast on. And we actually found some oyster shell here at Fatty's, and we don't know if they were buying them off of Palmer or they were sharing, who knows. But it's an interesting connection or tie. We also found, some of their personal belongings, like this little gold leaf porcelain here. We also found evidence for what types of things he might have sold in his curio shop. And so on the left-hand side, you can see a bit of a bottleneck that would have been one of the Zhang's beer bottles. And we found, I want to say, like, and I'm not exaggerating, I think probably 300 bits of bottle caps, like beer bottle crown caps. So they were drinking lots of beer out there and throwing it in the pond when they were done with the cap. We also found, if you read the historic sort of accounts of what people were selling out there, you would know that they were using the local rock, this gypsum, this white gypsum, because it's nice and soft, it's easy to carve little figurines that they sold in the shops. And we found a little bit of a foot that we think of a sort of Native American foot that would have been part of one of those little figurines that they had carved and sold at the shop. And in the bottom right-hand side, it's a little difficult to read in this photograph, but it says it's a bit of a porcelain or stoneware, ceramic. I'm not sure if it's a plate or a platter, but it says Gateway Garden of the Gods. So you can see sort of some of the writing on that as one of the other types of curios they would have purchased. We also found bunches of old 35 millimeter film, which we thought was really interesting as well. So Fatty's place burned down in 1907, very shortly after General Palmer purchased it from Fatty's widow. Fatty actually died in 1902. And then his widow, Phoebe, ran the curio shop for another 5 years. Then she remarried and they decided to sell. After that time, one of the interesting things is in the sort of landscape, we could see this sort of straight alignment that looked like the foundation of a house. And in 2019, when Minette was out there with her students, they tested that and they identified some foundations of a building, which you can see in the picture on the right-hand side there, that were not in the right alignment to be part of Fatty's place. And so we were really confused as to what was going on. Later, we found this picture, this historic photograph here on the left-hand side that shows a second sort of curio shop at that spot that is in that right alignment. And after doing some research, we identified that Strausenback, which that name might sound familiar to you if you are familiar with Garden of the Gods history, but he later started the Garden of the Gods trading post in its original location. But before he did that, he rented this building that you see here and that spot of where Fatty's shop used to be, and ran it there before moving his shop to the current location of the Garden of the Gods trading post. So we think that what we're seeing is sort of multiple occupations of these trading posts at this site. So I know we're running out of time, so we just wanted to sort of tie it all together a little bit. And one of the things that Minette and I really wanted to sort of stress is this fact that we're really starting to get a sort of more full picture of what Colorado Springs history was like. What did it look like for the people who were living in these tuberculosis sanatoriums? What did it look like being a neighbor of famous General Palmer, and sort of living during the time of Colorado Springs when tourism was really the main industry? And we're starting to round that picture out, and it's starting to become really interesting, we think, and we hope you think so too. Minette, did you have anything you wanted to add? Oh, the other thing I will mention is that you can see evidence of a lot of this stuff at the exhibits that are currently there at Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. So when you get a chance, make your appointment, go in and go check them out.
So thanks, and the only thing, Karen, I would add, I just saw a question pop up, and I, of course, couldn't see the questions that were popping up while I was talking, but I could see the ones that were popping up while you were talking. And what the most recent one I just saw was about the petrified body that rumor has it was in the Curio shop. And as far as we know so far, and this is us and also Anna Cordova, who's been working on this with us for the city, there was basically a carved, more or less life size.
It wasn't life size. Actually, it was sort of baby size.
Baby size. Okay, out of gypsum.
Yes,
out of not an actual petrified, and this is probably the thing we most want to pinpoint here, is there was no actual petrified body, but there was, yes, so I'm sorry I interrupted you, but yes, there was a carved gypsum Indian, and that rumor has been flying around for a very long time.
And so there's actually quite a bit of evidence that Strausenback, or somebody before, actually whoever owned it before him, sort of commissioned the carving of this as a sort of a tourist attraction. And we can see advertisements on the side of the buildings, on the side of the curio shops. So when Strausenbach moved from that site where Fatty's used to be to the new trading post, he actually took that with him, and the sign as well, which is one of the ways that we can identify the connection between the two trading posts.
Can I get you to go back a few slides to the first historic slide you showed with the woman with the donkey in the cart? Real quick, because we've been doing a little bit throughout this talk of asking people, like, if you know anything about questions. And so there's the building that's across from Fatty, across the road there on the left side of that picture. We think we're seeing the foundation. We're definitely seeing building foundations over in that area. There was a fence and an irrigation ditch, which you can kind of see, and there's still a bridge over a drainage there. But if anyone knows anything, I mean, we've been through the Garden of the Gods archives and other archives, trying to figure out what that house is, what that building is. It looks rather substantial, but we're really having a hard time finding out anything about it. So if anybody sees that or knows anything about that house, that's another thing we'd like to put out there. Like, please email us and let us know what you know. We would really love that. Thank you.
So Karen and Minette, there's actually a couple questions from the Facebook Live video, if I could share those with you. And then I know we have some in the chat that we need to address as well.
Okay.
But on Facebook Live, someone asked, and hopefully I'm explaining this correctly, might you do some of the CCC camps, especially the one closest to UCCS Templeton Gap?
I've talked to, Bill Arbogast, who we work with sometimes, who's retired, so he's only here part of the year. But that's something that he's also been interested about, and he actually handed me a file last fall saying, "Hey, here's what we know about the CCC camp." But yeah, I mean, there's so many things I'm interested in doing. There is a little bit of a one thing at a time. I mean, we're working on the fatty rice thing, and in part that's because we were working along with priorities of the city. So the city was going to do some construction, and it was going to potentially impact the site. And so a lot of this is the way we prioritize what we want to do going forward in research and teaching the field school is often driven by our partnerships with the Department of Defense down in Fort Carson, or the city of Colorado Springs, or the Air Force Academy, or those kinds of partnerships, which has been really, really wonderful. And it does steer us to kind of prioritize our list of things that we can do. And I know Karen, I mean, did you, what Karen did with students was got a grant and did a sort of a cultural resource master plan for campus, for the UCCS campus. And so I think there were CCC construction projects that, Karen, you can probably mention that you recorded, that we at least know about and are recording, and hopefully in the future growth of campus, we can work around those sites so that they don't get destroyed before we can look at them.
There's another question. Has there been much excavation at Red Rocks Canyon Park, where the Bott family once had a dump?
Karen, do you know the answer?
Not that I know of. I know Anna has talked about doing some survey out there, but we haven't been a new part of that, so.
Right, I know they had an archaeologist, a cultural resource management person go out and do recording out there, but I'm not familiar enough with the results to know. I know that they didn't do any excavations. I'm hoping that they did some site recording, and yeah, it sounds like Anna wants to do some more in that area.
I know Anna's in the room, if you will. So this is kind of a, I actually got an email question too. I'm getting questions from all these different avenues. I'm wondering if Colorado Springs is unusual and that we have a city archaeologist. Is that unusual?
It is unusual. There are some in other states, mostly on the East Coast, but here in Colorado, I only know of two. And Anna is one of them, and the other one is in the city of Boulder. So it's very unusual, and it's very lucky to have that, because it can help. It's really sort of helped not just with these projects, but also with our partnerships with the tribes. Anna's been doing a ton of work and making great headway with that.
Awesome.
Yep.
And then
I would add that our campus is really lucky to have all of this happening too, because UC Denver has, particularly the Entrance campus, has a lot of historical resources, and as far as I know, there's nobody doing the cultural resource management for campus up there.
Yeah, I think they're starting to do some work there on campus. The anthropology departments there have begun doing some of that. They did some ground penetrating radar. They've been doing some testing as well.
Oh, that's great to hear.
That is pretty recent. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, one final question that came up quite a bit earlier. Do either of you know if there is sort of like a volunteer crew or a way that the paupers feel the cemetery is being cleaned up and monitored?
I believe that I'm not sure. I actually don't really know the answer. I think John would know, and I think he's told me, but I can't remember what he's told me. So I'd have to get back in touch with John Moore, who last I knew was working for the city and doing work towards rehoming homeless people. So doing some really good work. So I need to ask him because I can't seem to remember. I do recall that he said somebody does take care of it a little bit, but I'm not sure who that group is. So that's a good question, and I'm sorry I don't have more of an answer.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for this wonderful presentation, and thank you everyone for sharing your question and your comments. I love that we had Facebook and email questions coming in, so this was a great success. Thank you, Karen and Minette. Just as a reminder, we're so excited to continue our Scholar Series throughout the sesquicentennial year 2021. I included in the chat function, you can see that full list we're hoping to publish in December, and also video recordings of past lectures, including this one at cspm.org/scholar series, or of course you can go to our YouTube page, which I also included. So a lot of great content that you can check out from this past year. And of course, moving forward, we have some exciting things coming up. Thank you again, Karen and Minette. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. Yeah, take care.
Thank you.